On Thursday, the United States Department of Commerce announced that the country's GDP had fell by 9.5% in the second quarter, which equates to an annualized decrease of 32.9% and sets a historic record. At the same time, we also got the news that consumer spending is down by 10.1%, which sets its own record. As we wait for Congress to get its act together and pass legislation to help Americans, is the White House doing everything that it can to do the same? A unique thing about this recession is the stark divide between the parts of the population that are actually feeling it. Of course, it's pretty normal in recessions for different parts of the population to be doing better than others, but it's not as normal for the two outcomes to be so neatly polarized. Essentially, if you've kept your job during this pandemic, you're probably actually doing very well. If you haven't, you aren't. And that might sound obvious, but there's a really important distinction there. I'm not saying that the people who've kept their jobs are doing better relative to the people who aren't. I'm saying that if you kept your job, you're actually probably doing better off than you were before the pandemic started. Because it's not just GDP and consumer spending that are setting records. In April, the personal savings rate hit 33%, which is another historic high. On the flip side, the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, recently suggested that Americans who have lost their jobs, which now account for over 30 million people, should just take out loans in order to make up for that lost income. Even though delinquencies as a share of credit card debt has now reached a 2-year high, which suggests that Americans are having a really hard time servicing their debt as it is. So you have a situation where Americans who have kept their jobs are having less to spend their money on and saving money at a historic rate, whereas Americans who have lost their jobs are relying on shaky unemployment benefits or living off of credit for as long as they can, if not both. To make matters worse, the little relief that Congress has passed is about to dry up. Democrats are looking to pass robust and generous relief packages that Americans can rely on well into the future, but Republicans aren't willing to commit because that legislation would be expensive, and they're concerned that they would end up passing spending that'll go to Americans who don't necessarily need it, like the folks who are saving at record rates. Mind you, this concern was absent when they were passing $1 trillion in tax cuts, but I digress. What doesn't get talked about as much is what the White House could be doing to help in these efforts. Some of you might be familiar with the executive agency that Senator Elizabeth Warren built called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or the CFPB. Generally speaking, the Trump administration hasn't really been that interested in the CFPB fulfilling its mandate, but it could really come in handy right now. For example, Congress has shown a willingness to help borrowers out in the case of macro events like this pandemic. There are provisions in the CARES Act that grants borrowers of government-backed student loans automatic forbearance into the fall. The CFPB could do very similar things with a wide variety of consumer debt, including credit cards, auto loans, and even mortgages. They could easily institute a rule that says in the case of a macro event like this pandemic, borrowers are entitled to automatic and universal forbearance, and they wouldn't even have to wait for Congress. If the White House wanted to get really serious about consumer protection, they could make these rules apply to micro events too. So far, the government's really only accepted the idea that unfortunate things can happen to otherwise responsible people in the case of macro events like a pandemic or a wildfire. But if a person deserves forbearance in a pandemic, then why don't they when they get cancer, or when their house burns down, or there's a major accident? During those times in a person's life, the last thing they want to be worried about is petitioning their creditors for relief. The CFPB could make that automatic if the president wanted. I bring this up because the general discussion around the pandemic response has kind of assumed that the economic fate of Americans is up to Congress, and that the White House's responsibility is more so just testing or other administrative stuff. And I want it to be clear that the responsibility is shared by both. Inevitably, the White House is going to start blaming the government's failure to provide for Americans on Congress. And don't get me wrong, Congress has done a subpar job to say the least, but that responsibility is shared. There's things that the White House could have been doing to protect individual consumers months ago, but it's pretty much abdicated any responsibility it's had at all in that effort. and I find that unacceptable. When the pandemic first started, if the White House was predominantly concerned with protecting American citizens, it would have immediately directed the CFPB to start looking into rules like this and any other ways that it could protect consumers from the pandemic destroying their personal finances, especially considering that it was already going to leave them more vulnerable by decreasing their job security. And that is the expectation that we should have of the president. Not only that they will get behind large legislative agendas that we support, but also that they will have the wherewithal and the willingness to use the extensive tools of the executive branch to help people when and where they can. Thanks for stopping by this week and watching another video. I particularly appreciate you making it all the way to the end because that's actually a metric that matters a lot on YouTube. The other metric that matters a lot is subscribers. And my metrics tell me that there's about 70% of you that are watching these videos every week that haven't subscribed yet. So if you wouldn't mind, I'd love it if you hit that button. I'd also love it if you shared this video. One of the things that really drives me to put these out every week is the idea that we could have a robust conversation around these topics in the future. Either way, have a great week and we'll see you next Sunday.